Welcome back to Old School Sports and our Out of the Park Baseball 23 playthrough of the Colorado Rockies. And it is the end of an era today, the end of our OOTP 23 saga. And want to start off by thanking all of our viewers, all of our commenters, everyone who's given us a thumbs up along the year. Especially want to thank the regular and loyal commenters. You all know who you are and have definitely learned a lot from you and everyone else who has commented over the past year. Definitely made me a better player of OOTP 23, and hopefully these videos in the comments have helped make all of you who have watched them better at playing the game as well. And as I mentioned, we are coming to the end of an era today. It's March 26th, and I just looked back, and our first OOTP 23 video last year was on April 26th when we started out with the Kansas City Royals. So exactly 11 months to the day, all going to come to an end. We've played 33 seasons across Kansas City, Pittsburgh, and Colorado. Won over 3,000 games, 26 playoff appearances, and 8 World Series championships. So it's definitely been a pretty successful run as a general manager, and do sincerely want to appreciate all of the viewers who have watched this video and videos throughout our series. Without you watching these videos, I'm just a crazy middle-aged man talking to himself at his computer. So I do sincerely appreciate all of you who have watched these videos over the past 11 months. And we have ended up putting out over 200 videos, well over 200 videos across those three teams, 16 seasons with the Royals, 11 years with Pittsburgh, and now 6 years with Colorado. Mentioned the 8 World Series wins, 10 World Series appearances, including 2 three-peats, one of which we just completed with Colorado a few weeks ago in game time. So definitely after a second three-peat, seems like a good opportunity to go out on top and finish up this series in good fashion. And before we get into a final review of 15 players that really made the series, 5 for each team, that we're going to go back and see where their careers ended up. Just take a look at the summary. As I mentioned, we started in 2022 with the Kansas City Royals, had 3 straight years out of the playoffs before we finally put a good run together where we made the playoffs 12 of our final 13 seasons in Kansas City, won our first World Series in 2027, another in 2031, and then we completed our first three-peat from 2034 to 2036. Best season that we had in Kansas City was 104 wins when we ended up losing the division series in 2033. But overall, a real successful run after we won 102 games and unfortunately failed to win 4 in a row. Decided it was time to move on and look for another challenge. And that was when we took over the Pittsburgh Pirates and penny-pinching owner Robert Nutting. And we built a consistently good team in Pittsburgh, but we never actually got over the hump to win a World Series championship. We were with the Pirates for 11 years after missing the playoffs 2 out of our first 3 seasons. We made the playoffs for the next 8 years. Never made it to a World Series until our final 2 years with Pittsburgh in 2047 and 2048. And in both cases, we were easily dispatched in the World Series, 4-2 and 4-1. Penny pinching Mr. Nutting had fictionally passed away a few years before the end of our run in Pittsburgh. We were hoping we might get some better ownership, but his son ended up being even more difficult to deal with because he was also very tight fiscally, and he also had a controlling personality, so he was constantly making decisions for us, messing with a roster, putting out offers to people. And that meddling ownership was just not fun for us to play through those final years. So although we feel bad that we didn't win in Pittsburgh, and they did end up winning a World Series a couple years after we left with a team that we had largely built. Felt like it was time to move on and take a challenge of rebuilding the Colorado Rockies. Had a losing record our first season with them, but as you can see here, our last 5 years with them were pretty successful. Over 95 wins every year. And after not winning a playoff game our first 2 years in the playoffs, back-to-back World Series victories for the second three-peat of the run-through. Positive thing for us with the Rockies was that they got sold relatively early in our tenure, and we fortunately had the opportunity of the best owner that we've ever had while playing out-of-the-park baseball take over. Lenient in terms of his patience, generous fiscal personality, hands-off involvement, and an extreme winning priority. And you can see that we went from a budget, that's not the budget, we went from a budget of $200 million in our first season with the Rockies to we would be at almost $350 million for this upcoming 2055 season. And clearly that gave us an opportunity to expand to one of the top budgets and one of the top payrolls in baseball, which has certainly made it much easier to be successful with this team than it was in some of the early seasons with Kansas City and pretty much the entirety of our playthrough in Pittsburgh. So all in all, it's definitely been a successful run, 8 titles in 33 years, so won almost a quarter of the seasons that we played. We won it all. As I mentioned, over 3,000 wins, a .575 winning percentage, and outside of that 172-90 season, our first year in Pittsburgh, we've got no red and a lot of green in terms of our records. So definitely learned a lot. We do have a little bit of red in some of these less successful seasons as far as our overall game score, but also had a couple of monster seasons, 1126 game score with the second of the World Series championships in Kansas City, and coincidentally the second of our 3 straight World Series championships in Colorado. We had an 1109 game score in that magical 113 win season. You can see the Rockies have scored over 1,000 runs each of the last 2 years, so have definitely built up a crazy offense and a pitching staff that's proven to be pretty proficient at performing well in the unique scenario and situation that they have to deal with in Coors Field in that high elevation and thinner air in Denver. And in addition to the over 200 videos we put out over the past year with Kansas City, Pittsburgh, and Colorado, have also put out a number of tutorial videos on lessons that we've learned through the playthroughs. And obviously, as we're doing our Let's Play videos, there's lessons that we learn as we put those together and as we're just kind of talking through the decisions that we're making here online at YouTube. So I know that no one's going to have time to go back and watch all of these videos, but as I said earlier, hopefully my sincere hope is that you learn something every video you watch, even if it's just me making a ridiculous or silly or dumb decision and you saying to yourself, hey, I'm not going to do that. For me, that's still a victory because you still learn something, even if it was my ignorance that may have led to some of those decisions. So with the summary of the broad performance over, as I mentioned, I'm going to take a look at 5 players from each of the franchises that we've been GM for over the past year in real time, over the past 33 seasons of game time, that have really defined this playthrough in OOTP 23 for us over the last year. And part of the reason that I started the playthrough in Kansas City was they were a lower budget team that had a lack of success basically since they won that World Series about 7 or 8 years ago. But they did have some good young players coming up through the system, and the opportunity to manage Witt Jr. Beginning in 2022 was intriguing to me. We were able to get him signed to a somewhat front-loaded long-term deal, and he ended up spending his entire career with Kansas City. It was a pretty successful career. He was Rookie of the Year in 2022, 9-time Gold Glove winner, 10-time All-Star, won a Silver Slugger, was part of all 5 of our World Championship teams in Kansas City, and also won a handful of playoff MVP awards. Led the league in runs once, hits once, stolen bases 3 times. And the issue with him is that he just kind of fell off the map in his mid-30s. He went from a very productive player at the age of 34, 314 with 27 home runs, to at the age of 35, he hit just 207, 16 homers, and 386 at-bats. And he called it a career before he could get to a lot of the big milestones. With 339 homers and 1,186 ribbies, definitely had an outside chance at 400 homers, 1,500 ribbies if he had stayed healthy, and probably could have gotten close to 500 stolen bases if he had been healthy. Was going to be a long shot to get to 3,000 hits, but he still put up an 80.6 WAR over the course of his career, which is, you can see, actually you can't see here because they don't have the WAR, but historically a 80.6 WAR for a third baseman would typically put them in the Hall of Fame. But the voters went back and forth on Mr. Witt over the course of a decade before he dropped off the ballot. The highest he ever got was 67.7% of the vote in 2046. But despite being a cornerstone of the franchise that won 5 World Series in Kansas City and all of those Gold Gloves and All-Star appearances, Bobby Witt Jr. has still not been enshrined in Cooperstown. Second player to look back on in Kansas City who was a critical part of our championship teams and a critical part of all 5 of those championship teams, like Bobby Witt Jr., was Caleb Lagerwell, a young pitcher who we made a big trade for with Miami after his second year. Felt like we wanted to add a good, solid starting pitcher to our staff, and that is exactly what he ended up being. You can see he spent over a decade in Kansas City, was a consistent 10-plus game winner for us, and over the course of his career had 182 wins, 135 losses, a 3.82 ERA, most of that in Kansas City, obviously, where he was 156 and 100. And you say, okay, the guy spent 13 seasons in Kansas City and he won 156 games, so he was winning 12, 13 games a year. Not all that exciting. And perhaps you could say that about his regular season. He was typically our second or third starter through many of those years, and as you can see, went out and consistently was pitching 30 games a year as a starter for most of that time period. But the real magic of Caleb Lagerwell, and the reason that I'm mentioning him, was because of his postseason dominance. As I mentioned, he was part of all 5 of those World Series teams with Kansas City, 3-time All-Star. But in the playoffs, he was at his best, a 14-4 career record in the playoffs with a 3.61 ERA. You can see back in that magical 2034 season, he was 5-0 in the playoffs. And over those three-peat years, he was a combined 10-0 in the playoff runs there. And you don't see this in the statistical summary, but Caleb Lagerwell was also the winning pitcher in Game 7 of the World Series on 2 occasions during that run in Kansas City. So just an incredible playoff performer for us, and obviously a very valuable regular season performer for the Royals as well. Jonathan Ojeda is a third person who was critical to our success in Kansas City. He came out of Duke, and he was a college player, not a particularly great defensive player, who fell to us with the 32nd pick in the draft of 2034. And he made a very quick run through the minor leagues that year with us. We let him play 1 game in rookie ball, a few games in A, high A, and then more significant action in Double A and Triple A as a 20-year-old. And then as a 21-year-old, the next season, he came up and he became a fixture for Kansas City for the next 14 seasons. Led the league in home runs as a rookie when he somehow did not win the Rookie of the Year award. But he was a perennial all-star, won a bunch of Silver Sluggers, was a playoff MVP on multiple occasions. He was on our World Championship teams in 2035 and 2036. And then he also won another World Series with the Royals in 2043 after we had moved on to the Pirates. Similar to Bobby Witt Jr., his career was cut short by injuries. You can see he retired at the age of 34 after really kind of struggling those last couple years, hitting just 213 and 207 with 28 and 25 home runs, by far the lowest production in his career. But even though he retired at the age of 34, ended up hitting close to 600 homers, close to 1,500 runs batted in, and a career WAR of almost 46. Certainly was one of the most intimidating power hitters in the American League over the course of his career. Was on the Hall of Fame ballot for the first time this past season, where he got 48% of the vote. So think it's unlikely that he'll make the Hall of Fame. Similar to Witt, his career was over by the time he was in the mid-30s. But Jonathan Ojeda was really a gem that fell to us towards the end of the draft when we had been already having successful seasons in Kansas City, and being able to plug that big bat into the middle of our lineup definitely helped propel us to our 4th and 5th World Series titles while we were general manager of the Royals. But not all of the young players that we picked in the draft or picked up as scouting finds or international amateur free agency ended up being massive successes. Shi Tong Kin, you may remember him if you were watching the early days of the Kansas City series. This is a player who we brought on board in a minor league contract when he came up as a 21-year-old with a free agent from Taiwan. He was quickly named the number 4 prospect in Major League Baseball, and he had a monster rookie year for us, hitting 297, 25 homers, 92 ribbies. His second season with Kansas City, arguably even better, 293, 25 homers again, 114 ribbies. Let him go on the base paths a little bit, where he stole 17 bases, put up a WAR of close to 5. And he was a very versatile and pretty high-quality defensive player as well. So after that second season, we signed him to an 8-year extension for $122 million, thinking he was going to be a player that we would build around for the long term. And then he came back right after that, and you can see he hit a .187 in 278 at-bats for us. And his ratings after he signed that long-term contract just absolutely fell off the charts. I don't know whether we can still see the scouting here or not. Would love to see those old scouting reports. No, unfortunately, not saved for retired players, but those of you who are watching the episodes, and if you go back, if you're that interested, it would be the 2030 episodes through the first half of that season, where his ratings just totally plummeted, and we made the difficult call that this contract could potentially become a huge albatross, and we did what we had to do to get out of the contract after that half of the year. We traded away Jose Rodriguez, who ended up not really having too much of a career in the major league. But we were able to get the Rockies to take on that contract. Apparently they may have still had a more favorable scouting report than we did. But he was never really the same after that. He ended up spending almost a decade in the majors when all was said and done, but hit 231 in Colorado with 53 homers and over 2,800 at-bats after his batting average was almost 45 points higher, and he hit nearly as many home runs in about half the at-bats in Kansas City. So was a player who we thought we were doing something great with by getting him signed in his early 20s to a team-friendly contract that was going to buy out some of his arbitration and free agent years. But he really just completely imploded at that point, and we were fortunate to be able to offload that contract and not have to deal with paying him almost $15 million a year over a period of close to a decade. And the last player to talk about coming out of Kansas City is probably our most successful find. And I've spent a lot of time in the videos talking about how I like to invest heavily in scouting in terms of dollars and international scouting in terms of the sliders, because it does help you find better amateur scouting finds. And Alex Vasquez was one of those very early in our playthrough at the end of our first season. Signed him out of the Dominican Republic, and he was one of the top prospects in baseball throughout his minor league career. Ended up having an incredible career that did end up with him being inducted as a member of the Royals into the Hall of Fame when he got over 95% in 2052, his first year on the ballot. You can see he was Rookie of the Year for us in 2030. All he did that year was lead the league in doubles, ribbies, and win the first of his 3 batting titles. You can see 3 batting titles, led the league in OPS 4 times, led the league in WRC plus 4 times, led the league in ribbies 3 times, even led the league in home runs once, and just missed out on a Triple Crown that year, as I'm sure some of you who were watching back in 2037 remember. He was a member of the 3-in-a-row championship teams with the Kansas City Royals, and over the course of his career hit close to 300, over 500 homers, over 1,600 ribbies, over 2,500 hits. Was definitely an incredible scouting discovery by our scouting team, and certainly was a key contributor to multiple World Series championships in that great run that we had with the Royals. And moving on from the Royals to the Pirates, Luis Longoria is a player that we inherited when we started our playthrough in Pittsburgh. He had been drafted number 2 overall a few seasons before we joined the team. He came up through the minors, and you can see he had a nice run with the Pirates for 7 years. The issue with Longoria is that he was always fragile, and I think by the end of his time with us, he may have been wrecked physically. So we, as he got more and more established in the majors and he got into his arbitration years, his price kept going up significantly each season. We had him on a very tight pitch count. We also had a very quick hook with him, and we were able, as you can see, to get over 30 starts from him each of his 5 final years with the team, despite his fragility. He was a pretty consistent pitcher for us, 14, 14, and 12 wins. Definitely had some incredible stuff. You can't see that now, obviously, with him having been retired, but his stuff and his movement were both close to off the charts when he was at his peak. He was a 4-time All-Star, and when he started to get real expensive, we did let him move on in free agency to the Cubs, and you can see they actually got 3 consecutive 30-plus starts out of him also. So for a player who had a lot of health limitations, the fact that he pitched over 30 starts for 8 consecutive years was pretty surprising. You can see he was not nearly effective in Chicago as he was with Pittsburgh. Ended up leading the league in walks 4 times in his career with Pittsburgh, and his ERA jumped by almost a 1.5. So a player that we felt like we got the best out of in terms of value and in terms of keeping him healthy during the time that he was with the Pittsburgh Pirates. And if you watched our playthrough with the Pirates, you may remember in the early stages of that playthrough, coming off of one of our early poor seasons, we ended up winning the draft lottery and getting the number 1 pick in the entire draft for 2038, which we used on Actually, that was our first year in Pittsburgh, I believe. I believe it was because they were poor record the season before, and we just happened winning the draft lottery when we first took over. So it felt like we were in a great spot. Number one overall pick in the draft. We had a big detailed episode where we dug into the players and came up with the decision that at the time the center fielder Henry Gonzalez was the way to go. And you can see for a time he was the number 19, 18, 12, 24, 16 prospect in baseball. So one of the top prospects in baseball, came up to the majors in 2043 and won the Rookie of the Year, was also named an All-Star, 271 average, 24 homers, thinking he was going to have a big future ahead of him. Second year, hit 264 with 20 home runs, was named an All-Star for the second time. And then it wasn't a Shi-Tong Kin kind of drop-off for him in his mid-20s. But he just never really got any better. He kind of remained the same player that he was, with a little less power over the years. And eventually, after 5 seasons, we moved on from him in Pittsburgh. You can see he's still in the major leagues at this point. He spent time with Toronto, Baltimore, Houston, back with Pittsburgh after we moved on to Colorado, and then with the Cubs for the last 3 years. But at this point, he's kind of a fourth outfielder. He's had certainly a respectable major league career, over 1,200 hits, 150 home runs, closing in on 600 runs batted in, career WAR of over 20, but never became the perennial all-star and potential Hall of Famer that we hoped he would when we picked him number 1 overall. Player who had a really interesting career in Pittsburgh that was critical to our success is the relief pitcher Greg Gaylord, who we picked up in a big trade from Kansas City. We had to send some cash and 5 players along to Kansas City to Tampa Bay to pick him up. I'm still talking about Kansas City. We picked him up from Tampa Bay, and you can see he had a nice run as a reliever in Pittsburgh for a full decade, most of which was when we were the general manager of the team. 560 games. He started 23. He had 136 saves for us, a 61-38 record overall with a 3.13 ERA, 801 strikeouts, and 687 innings. The interesting thing about him is that he was a 2-time All-Star in 2045 and 2047. He was also reliever of the year on 2 occasions in 2044 and 2047. 29 saves in 2044. We promptly took the job away from him the next couple years. Had him fill in again as our closer in 2047, and he got the reliever of the year award again with crazy numbers in those years. A 129 ERA the first time he won it, a 149 ERA the second time he won it. But we always kind of were having our eye on somebody who looked better on paper to be our closer. So other than those 2 seasons when he was reliever of the year and his first year with the Pirates when he got 44 saves, he was never really a regular closer for the team, was still a very valuable pitcher, but somebody who we probably didn't give a fair shake to as far as the opportunity to close for the Pirates consistently over the course of a decade. And another player who had an impact in Pittsburgh as well as Colorado was Yoshitaro Nakahara, good old Uncle Nakahara. He was a Japanese player who played in Japan, and then with the OOTP licensing issues with Japan, his career was switched to South Africa. But he was a perennial all-star, an MVP over there before he decided to come to the major leagues in his 30s. And all he did in his first season with San Diego was win the Rookie of the Year award in 2044. He hit free agency after 3 years in San Diego, and he was a player who was wrecked physically at that point in his mid-30s. We took a flyer on him, and he had a nice year for us, 28 home runs in 360 at-bats. But after that, he could just never remain healthy. And yeah, I can see we did have him in Pittsburgh our final year with the Pirates. We made a trade for him when we took over Colorado, and we had him on the roster the first 3 years in Colorado. But in 1 year in Colorado in 2050, he was relatively healthy again and hit 28 homers again in 377 at-bats. So incredible power when he was in the lineup. The issue was just he was a broken down player in his mid-30s by the time we got our hands on him in both Pittsburgh and Colorado, and he was a interesting roster decision for us some of those years just to even keep him on the roster. Overall, he was productive when he played. 33 homers in 545 at-bats in Pittsburgh, and 38 home runs in 551 at-bats in Colorado. The issue is, though, that those kind of numbers, which would be good numbers for a single season in either place, were acquired over 2 years in Pittsburgh and 3 years in Colorado. So he just was unable to stay healthy. And the final player we'll look back on from our time in Pittsburgh, not going to be a surprise to anybody, Isaiah Hill. This is a guy who had been a first-round pick for the Pirates before we took the team over, was coming up through the system, joined us by 2039, and all he did in the 2039 season was lead the National League in WAR, and he joined Fred Lynn and Ichiro as the only players to win Rookie of the Year and Most Valuable Player in the same season. And he had a really impressive 7-year run in Pittsburgh, led the league in homers and ribbies for us, slugging percentage, perennial All-Star, perennial Silver Slugger winner, won a second MVP award in 2041 when he did lead the league with those 50 home runs. He was a player that we just could not afford to keep, though, so we ended up trading him away to the Dodgers for a package. We had to get the salary off of our books. It was a painful trade to make, but it was just not a player that we could afford in Pittsburgh. And since then, he's played with the Dodgers, the Yankees, and Boston. And you can see he has had one of the most incredibly consistent careers in imaginary baseball history that you could imagine. He's never had fewer than 110 RBIs in a season. He's never played fewer than 149 games in a season. He is a durable, quality outfielder who is closing in on 3,000 hits, 700 home runs, and 2,000 runs batted in. Felt a little bit bad. The one hole that he does have in his career is that he's never won a World Series. And Colorado just defeated Boston in the World Series this year. So if you go back to our manager's office, you can see that Isaiah Hill had 2 home runs for Boston, 6 overall in the playoffs, even in his late 30s, as he tried to do everything he could to finally get a World Series title. But that is the only hole in the incredible career that Isaiah Hill has put together. And the one positive thing is that he did have his longest run and most of his success with the Rookie of the Year and the 2 MVP awards in Pittsburgh. So at some point in the future, he will certainly be a first ballot Hall of Famer wearing the Pittsburgh Pirates P on his cap when he is inducted in Cooperstown. Moving on to the Rockies and the 5 players that made the simulation interesting for us. Starting off with Dave Alvarado. After our unsuccessful first season in Colorado, we felt like we needed to make some changes to our pitching staff. And we were not a big budget team at this time, so signing him as a free agent to a 7-year contract for $168 million was an incredible risk for the Rockies organization. But he is a player who has great movement on his pitches, above average stuff, and control. He's also got those ground ball tendencies, a ground ball hitter in terms of his profile. So with those extreme ground ball tendencies, throwing in the mid to high 90s, and the ground baller pitcher type, felt that he could be a very useful pitcher for us to build around in Colorado. And he has not been exceptional in most cases, but he has definitely been a stabilizing force in our rotation. Started 32 or 33 games every year in Colorado. You can see over those 5 years his record is 68 and 45. So close to 14-9 is kind of the average season he's put up in Colorado. The 4.11 ERA, not particularly impressive, but he is pitching half of his games in Colorado. Has put up a 22 WAR over the 5 seasons and a 3.34 SIERA with the Rockies, and has definitely been a consistent first or second starter for us throughout the entire run, including the 3 World Series championships in the past 3 seasons. And if the free agent acquisition of Alvarado is what set up our pitching staff for success, 2 trades the next offseason set up our offense for the incredible run that it's been on. First and foremost was making a big trade to bring on Robbie Carrillo. We had to give up a good young infielder / outfielder in Andrew Booker for him, a solid starting pitching prospect in Mel Armstead, as well as a middling prospect who looks like he's already retired in Nando Verkoven to bring him on board. But Robbie Carrillo over the last 4 years has really blossomed in Colorado, led the league in runs 3 times, hits once, triples twice, and also won a batting title in his 4 years with Colorado. He did just opt out of the big contract that he was signed to, so he's a free agent now. Unclear if the Rockies will be able to bring him back, but certainly the offensive skill that he brought to left field, and the fact that he also, in terms of left field, had some excellent range out there and a great error rating to really help cover that expansive area of left field in Colorado was very valuable also. Will definitely be a big loss if the Rockies need to move on from him, but he bringing him on board definitely helped take the offense in Colorado to another level. And another player who we traded for in that same offseason that really helped turn the Rockies around is the first baseman Elijah Moore. Making huge money. He'll be back with the team next year. Gave us another captain personality in the locker room. Just an incredible bat. And as we've talked about in previous episodes, 3 consecutive years leading the National League in home runs at this point. Was in the running in 2050 for a Triple Crown, which he ended up losing by about 10 points. But hit 61 homers last year, 62 homers this year. Perennial All-Star, perennial Silver Slugger winner, has won the 3 straight World Series. He has a couple of playoff MVP awards. Carrillo, I didn't mention when we were talking about him, but Carrillo hit 10 home runs in the playoffs this past season to finish off the three-peat, and Carrillo was the MVP of the NLDS as well as the World Series. Elijah Moore this year was the NLCS MVP, so those two shared all of the MVP hardware on the way to the World Series win this year. Elijah Moore has finished second in the National League MVP voting for 3 consecutive years, but is a 30-year-old, already has over 400 homers and over 1,500 ribbies, likely on his way to a Hall of Fame career. And speaking of Hall of Famers, Rogelio Loera was the most dominant pitcher in this entire playthrough through the early stages of his career when we were GM in Kansas City, through our whole run in Pittsburgh, and now through our run in Colorado. And after those first 3 seasons in Colorado, when we had made the playoffs 2 times but had still not won a playoff game, this incredible pitcher, as you can see, led the league in strikeouts for more than a decade in a row, led the league in WAR more often than not during the course of his career, led the league in wins a number of times, 11 total Cy Young Awards, perennial all-star, obviously. Hit the free agent market before the 2052 season, and we were able to convince him to come to Colorado, signed him to a monster contract, 3-year contract with a team option after the second season, which proved to be valuable for us. His first year with us, 18-6 record, led the league with 289 strikeouts, whip, strikeouts per 9, strikeout to walk ratio, FIP minus, WAR of 8.4, won the final in 11th Cy Young Award of his incredible career, and he also won the World Series with us in 2052. So he was the final missing piece of the puzzle, that really propelled us to finally get to a World Series championship in Colorado. He started off his age 40 season well, was named an All-Star for the final time in 2053 at age 40, and then he suffered an injury that kept him out for about a month. We had him on a rehab start in AAA, and then he suffered an injury that was going to keep him out for most of the next year. So we declined his option, which saved us over $30 million, proved to be a good contract from our perspective that we signed him to. And at that point, he was still chasing his 300th victory. He was at 390 when the 2053 season started, coming off a Cy Young Award. We definitely felt he would get it in 2053 with us. Unfortunately, the injuries kept him from doing that. And then after we let him go, he sadly became a little bit of a nomad over the final year of his career. You can see there that start in Albuquerque where he just went 2/3 of an inning and really suffered that significant injury that impacted his career, the ruptured UCL. He had the forearm inflammation, was gone for 5 weeks. We put him on the rehab start, and right in that rehab start, ruptured UCL, out for the rest of the year and into the next season, and we decided to move on from him. And after that happened, next year he split some time this past season between AAA and AA, came up with Seattle where he did get a win but put up a 4.96 ERA, was released by Seattle, signed with AAA and ended up in Las Vegas in the PCL where he went 1-7 with a 7.46 ERA, and he just retired a week or so ago, so he's called it a career. And the only disappointing thing in that incredible career is that with those injuries over the last year and a half of his career, 297 wins. So looked like he was going to be a shoo-in to get to 300 when he was only 10 away coming off of a Cy Young Award-winning season. But it was not to be with Rogelio Loera. That said, obviously a sure first ballot Hall of Famer with a winning percentage of over 667 for the course of his career, and some absolutely incredible numbers. Those last few years in Colorado and Seattle and even in Texas did push his career ERA up over 3, but similar to Mickey Mantle not holding on to the 300 batting average for the course of his career, it's certainly not going to prevent Rogelio Loera from being a first ballot Hall of Famer 5 years from now. And perhaps the craziest statistic for him, 6,354 strikeouts in less than 4,000 innings is obviously insane. Career SIERA of 1.90 is also kind of ridiculous as well. So just the most dominant pitcher imaginable, who had a great career. And he had his last taste of success in the major leagues with the Colorado Rockies. And the last player we'll talk about in Colorado is one whose story really hasn't been written yet. Got lucky and were a third pick in the draft in 2050 when we did well in the lottery. And we ended up doing a long episode back in 2050, a real deep dive into deep dive into the draft, looking at the top 10 or 12 prospects, walking through our decision making. And with the third pick, we ended up taking Elijah Smith, Porky Smith, who still viewed as the number 16 prospect in baseball. Came up through our system reasonably quickly over the years. Brought him up at the end of 2053 when he served as a closer for us at the end of the season. And then he had a really nice year working out of the bullpen for us this year. Led the league with 74 games, struck out almost a batter and a half per inning, 3.27 ERA, 3.5 WAR, a 2.18 SIERA. He will be moving into the Rockies rotation next year with the departure of some pitchers, and clearly was a contributor to 2 World Series teams with the Rockies already, and would think that over the course of his career, if he stays healthy with this incredible 5-pitch arsenal of well above average major league pitches, he's got some incredible stuff, above average movement, potentially above average control. He's still not even completely developed. Think that this lefty could potentially have a career that won't necessarily match what Rogelio Loera did, but could certainly result in him being a perennial all-star and maybe a potential Hall of Famer 20-25 seasons from now. And with that, we are going to close out our OOTP 23 adventure. It's been quite an interesting year. Once again, thank you to those of you who have watched our videos, commented on them, liked our videos, and just kind of shared your thoughts with us over the course of the year. It's definitely made it a very interesting adventure for us, and in the coming weeks, we will be beginning a new adventure in OOTP 24. I can only hope that it'll be as successful as this one in OOTP 23 was. Until our next episode, which will be in OOTP 24 rather than OOTP 23. Thank you so much for watching, and hope you have a great day.